Policing College workshops leading up to our conference this year on the 23rd of November at the University of London, but it will also be live streamed. So keep your eyes open there for the conference brochure and join us at that if you can. So today's subject, UK police legitimacy, policing after the pandemic. What is the new normal, if there is a new normal? Two fantastic speakers again for you today between now and 6 o'clock for the next 2 hours. We'll be joined later by Dr. Andy Bain. Andy is a world-renowned international researcher and academic, working mainly in public safety with both police and correction agencies. Done a lot of work, particularly around policing with gangs, technology, community policing, and has a number of academic papers published. He's going to come on later on and join us, but we will begin, I'm delighted to say, with the CEO and founder of the London Policing College, Rod Jarman, QPM. Rod, if you don't know, a fantastic background in policing, my boss for many years, and one of the finest bosses, may I say so. But ended his career as a Deputy Assistant Commissioner, as Director for Leadership and Learning, and he's taken that skill set and that knowledge built up managing the UK's largest police force and turned it into what is now the London Policing College. Without further ado, ladies and gents, I'm going to hand you now over to Rod and hope you all have a fascinating afternoon. Rod, good afternoon. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that very nice introduction. This afternoon, the way we're going to do this is I'm going to do a little bit of a whiz through my thoughts around what's happening in terms of the response to the crisis that the world is in at the moment, and how that affects policing, and what I think is the risks to police legitimacy and police performance as a result of that. So I'm going to do that very much from a UK focus. When I've gone through that, so I'm laughing at the number of beeps. I'm just trying to keep in between the beeps to speak. When I've gone through that, Andy's going to take over and have a look at some of the very operational issues from an American perspective and from his work in the area of youth crime and in policing in the Americas. So I think this afternoon you're going to get quite a varied view of things. We're going to try and have a break about 5 o'clock. The last sort of chunk of time, I really want us to look at sort of 4 specific questions, and those questions really are around the key issues for policing, and I'm going to set them as we go through this afternoon. We'll have a bit of a break and then we'll come back and try and get as much interaction from you into this as possible. So as we go through this afternoon, if at any stage you want to make a comment or say something, put it in the chat bar. That's the little bubble button on the top of the screen. Just put a note in. Andy will watch when I'm speaking, and if he sees anything that he thinks I ought to talk about, he'll intervene, and I'll do the same for him. But generally we'll just capture that, and that will be part of our response when we come back later on. So don't feel you have to hold on to things. If there's something that is said and it gets a reaction, put it in there, because I want to really involve as many people as possible in the discussion this afternoon. So that's sort of generally. The title of my conversation is around police legitimacy and policing after the pandemic. And I suppose the starting point is, what do I mean by legitimacy and pandemic? So I wanted to be very clear that, in my view, the legitimate perception, or the perception of legitimacy that the public have in the police, is fundamental to policing style in the UK, and that a lot of that policing style, an issue of that policing style, will affect the way that we do business and will cause us problems over the longer term. So what I want to do today is just unpack that a little bit and have a little bit of a look at what I've been thinking about in terms of the crisis that's the pandemic. I started this off by saying crisis, what crisis? Because we've focused on COVID for many reasons. You know, it's a massive impact that's hit the whole world, and we've talked about it quite often in the press and in conversations as if it's something that's never happened or is never going to happen again in terms of a world event. And we've also talked about it, and I was very clear about my analysis of it last year, that it's been approached as a health event, not an event on the complete system of how the world runs. We've had, back in 2008, we had the credit crunch, which affected every part of the world, and the outcome of that is still affecting in the UK. We had many years of austerity, and we were just beginning to start thinking about changing things again as we came out of that, and coronavirus came along and has changed that. And we've also got this underlying world crisis of climate. And I think the big issue that I think we ought to be looking at is how all of these crises connect together, and what's the outcome when you have multiple crises coming together. How does that impact upon how we do business? How does that change the way that we think about policing from our specific subject matter this afternoon? So in the UK, we've talked about COVID, and we describe where we're at the moment as being in a period of recovery, a return to normality. If you walk around, I walked past the railway station this afternoon, and the local railway station, the car park is full again. The trains have got lots of people on them. People are walking around without masks and without any sort of feeling that there's an issue. So there's a perception and almost a setting of the position nationally that we are well on our return to normality. Now, in major incident terms, return to normality happens when once gold's strategy is met. It's a bit difficult to know actually what our strategy is at the moment, so whether or not we've met it is probably something to discuss. But we seem to be a bit early to be thinking about where we are in things, and that's a theme I want to come back into. The other thing about recovery is from what, and I think we've talked about recovery very much in terms of keeping the death rate down, keeping the hospitalisations down, and the NHS not being overwhelmed. But really, we haven't talked about the recovery of what's happened to everybody's lives. With over 136,000, I think it is, deaths in the country, very few people have not been touched by somebody close to them having been hospitalised or lost their life. That's a huge impact on a country and across the world in terms of an emotional response, and one that we haven't really worked through as to what that means in the future. What will people's perceptions be about their feelings of safety in the world, their perceptions of what is important to them? All those are big key issues that we need to work through. The other bit we haven't got at the moment is an evidence base of what's happened. So crises, major incidents have debriefs. So with the process in the UK called JESSUP, there is a requirement for a debrief, and there are loads of debriefs around. But we haven't yet got that far to actually debrief what's happened and what we've done and what worked and what didn't work. And the other thing about recovery is we seem to have a perception that recovery should be a sort of smooth general glide back to normal, and that we're going to land into a world of milk and honey. Whereas in reality, it's probably more incremental steps. And I think we've been living through some of those incremental steps. And I just want to pick that theme up a little bit as well. So I thought it's worth just looking at where we are. Almost 1,000 hospitalisations a day, nearly 1,000 deaths in the last week, and over 40,000 new infections every day for the last 8 days. We can't really claim that there isn't a serious issue here just with COVID. 6% of people in hospital in the UK are predominantly being treated for COVID. And when you look at the number of people in intensive care, is significantly higher. So the data would suggest that whilst we are thinking we're through the worst of the pandemic and the worst of the health issues, the truth is that there is still an awful lot happening. When we look at what that's meant for crime, I think it's worth looking at a couple of sort of sets of data The first one on the left of here is the makeup or the distribution of different crime types. The most important factor for that, for me, was that cyber and digital crime has gone from around 18% of crime to 55% of crime. Now that is a phenomenal shift in a crime type, and of a crime type that historically has needed quite specialist investigative techniques. So whilst the crimes might be relatively straightforward.
Little office has got,
No, that's his home. Okay.
We try and work out who's talking.
One of his offices in his home.
It's Mr. Rose, thank you. So while historically this has required a very specialist view to get into the investigation, the crimes themselves are relatively simple crimes, but they have this extra dynamic of needing technical skills. And our police forces in the UK, our staff, just have not got those skills. And as a world, I'm not sure that any police force has actually developed those skills. The other thing which has happened quite significantly, which is the graph on the right, which is a bit harder to see, but I'll just sort of pull out the key issue, is that there has been a significant and substantial increase in violence within domestic arrangements. That was happening before, and some of that was about reporting levels, but all of the survey information would tend to suggest that we have also seen a significant increase in the amount of violence within the home. And though lots of people have got theories about this, nobody's really got to a point of being able to explain what it is that's different about violence now from what it was like pre-pandemic. So those are the things that are happening in policing terms. I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the reality of recovery. So one of the problems is where we just focus on the health issue, we miss out some of the other issues that are happening. And I think that's part of the problem that's happened in the UK recently. So we've been quite surprised about staff shortages across many areas. We've been surprised about the supply chain not working. We've been surprised about the lack of materials and for production. Now these are all because this was a health emergency, but the crisis was a whole systems crisis. And we've seen over the past 18 months, the whole world reposition itself, and then the whole world start to come out at the same time. And we are in what I would think of as a risky low time at the moment, where these sorts of individual crises have got the potential of developing into something more significant. And in the UK, we saw over the last few weeks the shortage of petrol at a couple of petrol stations turning into a national emergency in a couple of days as people started to grasp with the lack of insecurity about supply of petrol and realizing that that would affect their ability to get to work, which would affect yet again their ability to make money. And I think this sort of differential in terms of how people perceive events is likely to have problems for us over quite a long time. People feeling insecure, meaning people react in a way which historically we wouldn't have expected them to. The other thing I just wanted to sort of talk about was connected with this, was a sort of thought process I have. If you may be aware of the huge amount of research and evidence around what happens on motorways and how a small incident can slow the traffic down at the beginning of a fairly heavily congested motorway, and you go back a few hundred yards and that ends up with a complete come to a standstill. You go back a few hundred yards behind that and you end up having somebody being rear-ended. And from what was generally a small issue at the beginning, you get these ripples of incidents running backwards down the motorway, and in some occasions several miles. And that has led, all that evidence has led to the implementation of smart motorways, the introduction of variable speed limits in the UK so that you can smooth things out. So quite often now when you drive around a motorway, you get your speed reduced from 70 miles an hour to 50 miles an hour, and you get to the point where something was and there's nothing there, because actually this whole reduction of the speed has smoothed out the incidents and prevented us having these sorts of jumps. And I suppose I think there's something for me to think, something that I think we should be thinking about here is that applicable to many other areas that maybe trying to run too fast at this stage, trying to be very congested and moving forward is going to cause a number of ripples as we have little incidents happening which become compounded and grow into something much bigger behind them. And from a policing perspective, what are the risks for us as police professionals and police officers to their role if these sorts of minor issues play out over time? So in a UK response to major incidents, we have a system called the JESIP, the Joint Emergency Service Interoperability Principles, which is much easier to say as JESIP. And from that, there are a whole number of debriefs of major crises and major incidents that have happened. One of the things that strikes me, the professionals working on resilience have fairly regular, they call them resilience huddles, meetings to talk about what's going on at the moment. And what struck me is one, the actual dedication of people across the partnerships who are trying to deal with the various issues, and secondly, just how tired they all are, having worked at this for 18 months and still having no light at the end of it. The one thing that when I went back and had a look through the joint organisational learning, the reports at the end of incidents, most of the major incidents that we talk about have a few hundred lives lost is absolutely massive. That is a really big major incident. For us to be having 1,000 lives a week lost is off the scale, and to have 140,000 lives over 18 months is something just unheard of in terms of previous work in this area. So one of the key areas that I think as a society we need to be doing is looking at, do these principles work effectively on something of this scale, and will they be effective in the future? And if we go back to those 3 crises I talked about at the beginning, the climate crisis would appear to be something that is going to grow and grow over the next few years, regardless of whether or not we get to a point where we have a plan to avert the underlying causes.
Susie, all right?
We know we're in for many years of problems.
Did the dog pull her over?
No, she was in the front garden, doing something in a flower bed, and she stepped.
Just trying to work out who was having problems with their dogs. So this is this for me for the future is thinking, actually, if we want to be able to respond effectively to what we know is coming, we know that these climate related incidents are going to grow and be greater. We know the effects of fires from droughts, the effects of flooding from rain, and the effect of heat and cold is going to be more intense in the future. Have we got the arrangements that are strong enough to deal with that? And have we actually learned from what's happened in the past 18 months to start building something that is at a more intense level to respond, and that has the resilience to cope with a long-term problem? So, you know, you come at that and you think, what do these things impact on? So we know that COVID's impacted on health, it's impacted on the economy, and really it's impacted on everything. We know from the credit crunch that it impacted on the economy, and through that, not everything, but most things were quite significantly affected. And I think we can be fairly certain that looking at the next few years, the data that's coming through around climate change at the moment would suggest that we are all going to be subject to fairly significant incidents that would normally be considered as major incidents in their own rights. So what is the policing element of this crisis, which is what we're supposed to be talking about today? So that's the sort of generic background. I think there are 3 things that made a big difference. One of them is the shift in demand, the shift to violence, particularly domestic and violence against women and girls, has been very significant. But it's not just been a shift in terms of numbers, it has also been a shift in terms of public perception of importance. And that has two dynamics working with it. So that is something that is a real issue for police forces, and not just in the UK. And I know from all of the work we did last year right across the world. And the other big was the shift in demand to digital that we've already talked about. We've had a real issue around resources. The UK, we've had many years of austerity, losing 35,000 police officers from the entire country, but also losing nearly the same number of police staff from the system. So the current increase of 20,000 officers, which is being heralded as a potential solution to problems of policing, is not going to take us back in terms of numbers to where we were before. Now, I'm not saying we actually need to be back in terms of numbers, that there were things that savings which were around doing things differently and changing them. But I do think there's a bit of a belief that 20,000 extra officers is some great pot of new people who we can use. And that growth has also got problems because all those officers have to be trained. On top of that 20,000 officers, in the same time spell, there's another 20,000 officers who are going to leave. So if you look at UK policing in 3 years' time, over 50% of the police officers are going to be in around 4 years service. So they're going to be young in service, which could be good because it probably means they're going to bring some digital skills with them that some of us at the other end of the age screen might not have. But it also means that they haven't got the experience of dealing with some of the things that comes from just working in the environment. The other resource issue, which is significant, is the new systems and rules and roles that we've had to create to manage COVID, from things like how we do business, how police officers interact with members of the public, how they use PPE, right through to how these things are actually distributed across the country. So the stuff we've heard from the MPCC and around having to set up warehouses to deal with equipment and get it out to people, having to develop very quick responses to new laws and brief people. All of those issues are quite significant and very resource intensive. And then what does that lead to in terms of challenges? So there's this shift in demand. We've also had a lot of demonstrations, and it's difficult to know whether that's more demonstrations than normal. It feels like more demonstrations than normal, but I think more to the point, it's a slightly different type of demonstration in the fact that people who've been demonstrating look like a slightly different demographic. So we've had people who predominantly in the past may well have been the silent majority starting to demonstrate about issues. And that causes quite a lot of issue because when you think about policing demonstrations, if there is any violence or if there are any problems there, we've got a group of people who normally would be very supportive of police right in the middle of what's happening. And that has an undermining factor towards police legitimacy. Other absolutely massive challenges, the last 18 months we've seen a big reduction in problem solving. The last 15 years we've seen crime in the UK drop, predominantly around problem solving and community-based policing approaches. Those have been scaled right back. They're starting to come back, but that's 18 months worth of ground that's got to be made up. And I think the last thing is workforce welfare and the challenge for police forces to look after their staff through what's happened, to keep them working in the most bizarre of circumstances in some ways, doing things that most police officers never thought they would be doing in their job, is always difficult. Police are very resilient and they bounce back, but we can see sort of cracks in terms of welfare building and the thoughts around the mental health of the staff going forward. So what does that mean for trust and confidence? So I think the first thing is that we know that identifying issues of community importance and being seen to dealing with them is the biggest driver of trust and confidence. There's loads of research around that, and the fact that community policing has been probably the first thing that stopped must cause some issues of concern. It must leave us in a place where we're thinking, will that cause problems over the longer term? Particularly when you add it to in London, the trust and confidence measures were slightly different to the rest of the country. in that we had what was always described as the New Scotland Yard factor, that actually you could normally, people would give extra trust to the Met Police because of New Scotland Yard. The last couple of years, we've seen a lot of criticism, public reports and issues around New Scotland Yard, not what's happening now, but the report into the murder of Daniel Morgan, the historic issues around the undercover policing operations. All of those coming out and being reported now are about things that happened 30 years ago, but they have an issue and may well undermine some of the residual New Scotland Yard trust. The other big issue is responding to differential outcomes, and we've seen through the Black Lives Matter debates last year that there are real pent-up energies within society, real concerns around differential outcomes for people from different ethnic backgrounds, for people with disabilities and people with different sexual orientations, and that if we're not seen to actually be dealing with them effectively, trust and confidence plays down. And one of the things we've seen from the world that's happened in the last 2 years is everybody watching the news much more than normally, and everybody seeing much more of what happens across the world. And we have this, that happened in America, but people think it happened in the UK just as easily as they think it happened in America. So there's all of those issues, and I think the other bit is there's probably a bit more focus than I've seen before about the response to objective reports. So, and by that I'm talking about things like the HMIC reports into performance and issues, and actually a bit more teeth in terms of the follow-up to check the forces are doing what they're supposed to have done as a result of an inspection. From a performance issue, I think the whole problem of resourcing over many years and the last 18 months focus and change in the way we do business has meant that the main focus has been on demand reduction. So we've moved to needing to be able to manage how much time people spend dealing with different issues. And if you're at the end of an inquiry where you can feel that that's what's happening with your inquiry as a victim, that's not a good place to be, really. It doesn't feel like we're providing a service. And so that whole issue around how do we manage demand. And I've just jumped back to the violence against women and girls bit here, because we know that domestic abuse is a particularly resource intensive investigation. To do it properly, we need officers who can spend time talking with victims, talking with witnesses and working in partnerships. So the greater the pressure there is on resources, the less time they have and the less capability that the police have to actually affect the outcomes that society want. And I think the last sort of performance issue, I think at the moment, is there's a lack of clarity. We seem to be moving away from clear ups and charges and arrests, and got rid of all the league tables, but they're beginning to come back now. So they're getting back into a focus on managerialism and looking at comparing one group of people with another. And I think over time, that is a real issue of a problem for the force or the forces, because we're not 100% sure, or they're not 100% sure of what it is they're chasing. What is it they've got to get right to get their tick in the box for performance? And when you don't know what it is you've got to get right, then you start having too many things to try and achieve. So I just thought it was worth going back to one of the models that was talked about at the time of the introduction of community policing, which was the reinvention model, which is an adaptation of Neuroyd and Beckley's model, looking really at police corruption. But it's talking about need to address crime coming up at a time of crisis, resources being moved towards that. You then get a need to build trust and confidence, so resources being moved over to community policing, and then you've realised that crime's come back up in the spots where you were supposed to be putting pressure or something's happened. So this seesaw of police priorities is something that is likely to be happening at the moment and likely to happen as we move forward. And what I think that gives to the public is a lack of continuity. And when we're concerned about trust and confidence, the continuity of the local officer, the continuity of the people dealing with their issues is so important to the community that this is potentially quite problematic.
Rod, Dean Andrews has just made a good comment. I saw a good example of conflict of values within the protest, within a protest crowd on BBC iPlayer documentary 4 Hours in the Capital yesterday. Some of the crowd were calling something similar to kill the police as they pulled the officer off the line, while other protesters helped the officer back onto the line. And I think we see that quite a lot in the US. So I don't know if you want to comment to that here in the UK.
Yeah, I think that's. I think if you look at the vigil into the murder of Sarah Everard, one of the issues that came out of that, for me, looking at it, was that you've got both people saying we've really got to enforce these measures. We've got to, we can't have one rule for one and one rule for another. And a lot of people very supportive of police action, and on the other hand, a group of people saying, that's absolutely outrageous. And what I think the big problem is, it's okay for people who can see that tension. But if people are going into a demonstration thinking that the police are going to treat them unfairly, and this happens, actually it reinforces that perception of unfairness. And that, for me, is where we have real risks going forward, because unless we can manage that message well, it starts looking like we're heavy-handed, or it looks like we're not dealing with things properly. So thanks, Dean, that's good. I think looking for the future, one of the things that I was trying to think when I was going through this was, it's all very well just saying it's doom and gloom and there are all these problems, but we ought to be thinking about what we could do. So I think there are a few things. One of them was that we needed a focus of what we're trying to achieve. And I think from a policing perspective, it is incredibly important that the police for themselves identify some key issues and make it very clear that that is what their focus is. And I think too often the police are knocked about by society and by politics with a big and small p into the flavour of the month without having that clarity of, no, we're going to deal with this because this is a big issue. And one of the things we have got at the moment is a sort of fairly widespread belief that violence against women and girls in society is fundamentally wrong at the moment, and that maybe policing could be part of the solution to that. The other thing is partners. The response to resilience has been for people to work together across partnerships, and many years to build that. And I think we seem to have a risk at the moment of moving away from partnerships, thinking they're not effective. But the reality is that for most of the things we want to deal with, we have to be working in partnership, and if we don't, police are going to take all the responsibility for it. So it's important to build those partnerships very clearly. And the last thing I was sort of thinking about was a pathway. So having a focus is one thing, but actually having what we're going to do almost at a national level and being very clear about it. I think one of the things that struck me last year was Martin Hewitt standing up and saying we're going to have a focus on, he was talking at that time about disproportionality, and we're going to build a plan nationally. And I think it's time for police forces to actually come together and work out what that is, and for everybody to commit to it. And I think there's some principles that we aren't using that we ought to. I think one of them is a bit like the motorways, that maybe we need to slow down a little bit. I think if we started saying here's a pathway of what we're going to do, and it's going to take us quite a bit of time to get there, but we're doing it in a fundamentally logical and seasoned way, we could take a bit more time and try and get some of the building blocks right, rather than the normal response that police have to have, which is the emergency happened today, you must have the solution tomorrow. So this concept of finding ways to slow down what we're doing, to slow down the issues we're dealing with, I think is really important. I think we need to consider a bit more what doesn't work. We spend quite a lot of time thinking about what does work, but we need to just sort of remember there are some things which we know don't work, and we ought to be thinking about them when we're coming to build solutions, and making sure that we don't do those things and just focus on the ones that work. So, you know, I was part of the revolution of the response to domestic abuse with the arrest policy, whereas we know now that the arrest policy is actually quite problematic. So the need to get these things right before we jump is very, very important. And that brings into what can we learn from evidence-based policing, and this is an area that I don't think police services have really grasped. There's a big national discussion in the UK that we're moving to evidence-based policing, but the reality is that we probably haven't actually, as a profession, grasped this as well as we could. So the College of Policing produce, you know, the bits of information with their analysis and reports, but that's not being transformed into how can we use that operationally, and how do we make that something that actually means something. And quite often we end up with half a response rather than the whole response, because people have got the name like hotspot policing, but they haven't actually worked through what we know works in hotspot policing, and it seems to be the answer for almost everything without working through whether it's the right solution to the problem. I thought, just as I talked a bit about domestic abuse, it was worth just having a look at the crime reduction toolkit about the sorts of things that appear to be working in domestic abuse. So we know that there are some preventative pieces of work, and there are some response pieces of work, but there's not that much around reoffending as yet that's got an evidence base behind it. So sort of thinking about where those issues are and driving future research and operations around them. So that was where I was. Sorry, I went one slide too many here to just give you a little bit of warm up to know that you're coming next. So what I really wanted to run through there and to give you some thoughts or some things to think about, which are that trust and confidence in policing and police performance are not things that sit on their own. We have to think about how they sit within what's happening in society. And at the moment, the issues of change in society are so great that if we aren't careful about managing them, we'll end up with police forces and the police service generally being pushed into lots of different areas and having a number of their own crises because they're not readily prepared for them. So what I'd like to do now is go over to Dr. Andy Bain, who's going to lead through some US perspectives, and then at the end of it, I want to ask some questions, one of them around what might we do about violence against women and girls, another one about what do we think might be the issues for the next 12 months that policing might have to deal with. So can we start thinking about what they are? So no further ado, Andy, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. It looks like I might be able to take control. If this works, all of our problems are solved, he says. Well, looks like it's working. Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I think it's afternoon for you guys, right? I'm currently 5 hours behind you, so I'm kind of playing catch up for you all. If I sound a little bit strange, it's not an American twang in my accent. I had a wisdom tooth removed last week, and it's kind of playing all kinds of funny stuff with my mouth right now. It didn't go very well. So please, if you've got any comments, if you want me to repeat something or go into a little bit more depth, just drop a comment and I'll see if I can pick it up for you. So very much as Rob was talking about, what I've begun looking at is what we mean by policing in a pandemic. Is there a crisis? Is it a crisis of confidence? Is it a lack of training? Is it a need for greater understanding? Where are we right now? And certainly, where are we in the United States? I've been very lucky in my time here in the United States to be able to work with a lot of local agencies and to go out on ride-alongs and do lots of observations with different agencies, not only here, but also in Vancouver, up in Canada. So I've got around a bit and seen a few things, and hopefully that's helped with a lot of the work that we're doing. So, that one there. Okay, so the story then for us today in this short session, if you like. I'm going to talk a little about inequalities. I'm going to talk a bit about training that's needed or training that's currently available, the evolution of crime in the United States as well as worldwide, which Rod also picked up on this development of cyber crimes. And then we'll look a little bit at communication. And again, I'm going to touch on training. And training, I think for me, training is my soapbox. Training is where I think we really need to look and really need to concentrate. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about for today. So inequalities then. The United States obviously has a history of inequality. We know it, it's well documented, we see it all the time. It's all around us, it's almost pervasive in everything that we do. But that's not only in terms of our traditions, we now see it much more in gender stereotyping and in sexual orientations, as well as poverty, race, gender issues, those kind of things. So there's lots there to unpack and lots to talk about. For the United States, it's no less prevalent today than it has been in the past. It now just appears to be a little bit more overt and perhaps a little bit easier to recognize. It's not only due to the pandemic and the public health crisis, I will say that, it's existed pre-COVID-19, okay? So it's important that we keep these discussions going and we keep them developing as we go. So one of the big things for me about crime, when you look at crime across the United States, is this whole thing about education and training, or education and employment, or the way in which we see employment in the United States. Georgetown University in the last couple of years have been researching what it means to be employable in the United States. And one of their findings has most recently been that to get a stable level of employment in the United States, you now need to have some form of college education. And they're saying that what we're averaging at the moment is 65% of all jobs requiring some form of college education. To put that into perspective, in the United States, it's not quite the same as the UK, although the UK now has the 18 system as well. Once you finish high school in the in the US, you're 18 years old and you move on to either a community college or a 4-year degree offering college, stroke university. So there's this interplay of where you're going to be. So you're already 18 by the time you leave secondary education and move into the workforce or move into college. But now 65% of those jobs require some form of higher education. That puts massive pressure onto local communities and local economies where there isn't a great deal of money, but education is formally paid for here. To give you an example, a state school will cost you, state university, sorry, will cost you somewhere in the region of $14,000 to $18,000 a year to attend. Private colleges will cost you somewhere between $25,000 and $40,000 a year, okay? Do your quick maths on that, it's about 75 pence to every dollar. So you're talking around about 10 to 30,000 pounds a year for your education, okay? Now, if you don't have that kind of income, if you don't have that kind of resource, it makes attending college very, very difficult. It also means that when you leave with a great deal of debt. Some students that we see coming through the educational system now have a great deal of support from their local communities. They have a great deal of support from the local grants they can get. The rest of it is all paid out in loan. So if you can imagine going to a private institution and paying £30,000 a year for 4 years, you're now coming away with something in the region of 120 to 150,000, including interest, of debt. That's the same as a mortgage for a house, right? This is big money. So that factor alone makes it very, very difficult for people to advance themselves. According to the according to the latest census information from 2020, those with bachelor's degrees can actually earn up to 67% more than those that have just a high school diploma. So the gains are huge if you can afford that cost. If you can afford that level of debt, then you can benefit greatly. One of the things that we tend to forget about when we're working through policing, when we're working in local communities with law enforcement agencies, which not only covers policing, but also probation services, parole service, okay? We're now seeing that 70% of everybody we work with actually lives in a state of poverty. So their level of understanding, their level of engagement in the community, their level of opportunity is very, very different from those people that are either governing the local cities, the local municipalities, or those people that are making the rules, those people that have access to other services. These people don't. And if 67% of all jobs require more than a high school diploma, 65 to 67%, then those people can't access that either. And that's really, really important to understand, because it does mean that those people are at a disadvantage straight off the bat. I wanted to take a look at inequalities because, as I said, there are lots and lots of different inequalities that actually appear in the United States. And a good source of that information is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. This year's report that they brought out earlier this year shows us that nearly half of all African Americans experience some form of racial discrimination. 18% of Asian Americans say they've experienced discrimination when interacting with the police. Indian Americans are very much the same and much more likely than Chinese Americans to report unfair police stops and treatment. 1 in 5 Latinos avoid medical care because of the way they think that they're going to be treated. 34% of the LGBTQ Americans say that they or a friend have been verbally abused when using a restroom. 41% of women have been discriminated against in equal pay and promotional opportunities. It's 2021. This is amazing, right? We're still finding the same data that we've been finding for decades. And it doesn't seem to be progressing in the way that we need it to or want it to. And there are lots of things that we can focus on, or lots of things that we can talk about. But really, you know, if we take race as being the one that people most generally understand, or those people, or that people most generally can relate to, because it's the one that we highlight most often, then we begin to see this picture unfolding that really needs to be tackled at source. It really needs to be dealt with much more effectively than we see it has been up until today. I just need to take a drink, sorry. I might be British, but I still have to have my tea. Even today, black males are 5 times more likely to be stopped by the police than white people. The black population actually only accounts for 12.4% of the entire US population, which now is somewhere around 329 million people. So just think about that for a moment, okay? You're 5 times more likely to be stopped and searched by police, even though the entire population is much, much, much smaller than the rest of the population, 12.4%, right? So that gives us an indication of where this is going, where we are right now. White men actually make up 31% of the population. So not only are you 5 times more likely to be stopped, you're actually less than 50% the population of another group. Does that make sense? What is it that we expect to find here? The black male population make up 34% of all numbers of men in custody. So they're a much smaller population to begin with, but they're a much greater population in custody. And those numbers really don't add up at all. According to the Vera Institute in 2018, which was a really interesting thing to pick up for a lot of my students, and a lot of the officers that I worked with, what we began to see from 2018 moving forward was that if you were a black male born today, then 1 in 3 black males would go to incarceration at some point in their lifetime, compared to white, compared to Hispanic, compared to anybody else, okay? So Hispanic males, it's 1 in 7, and white males is 1 in 17. Those numbers are huge. That disparity in numbers is just astronomical. And you begin to then understand where these feelings of discrimination can come from. Okay, so you live in poverty, you've got less access to education, you've got less opportunity to pay for an education because of your education and welfare position, but you're also much more likely to live in a position where you're more likely to be stopped, you're more likely to be accused, and you're more likely to be convicted and incarcerated, where the same offence may net a white male or a Hispanic male a community order. Okay, so that's really kind of one of those important factors that we tend to forget about. Overall, reports show us that there's a greater number of street crime in the United States than any other form of crime. Yes, there's been an increase in violence during the pandemic period, and certainly there's been a massive increase in domestic violence, okay? And that violence has been caused by a number of issues. The first one being that during lockdown periods, those families are now back together. So where that usual perpetrator, and I don't really want to say male or female, but where that perpetrator would normally have been out of the house, out of the family for at least a portion of the day, during that lockdown period, everybody is now much closer together and they're there all year round. Okay, so that makes it very, very difficult. Tensions are high. Tensions are made higher when during that lockdown period, companies have to cut back on staffing. And if you're in one of those positions where you've actually been told that you're being laid off, or where there's no more work for you as a self-employed person, those tensions get higher. Where are you going to be able to pay your rent, your mortgage? How are you going to be able to provide food? Where's food coming from? Yeah, there's a lot of pride around whether or not you would go to a food bank. And there's been an increase in people using food banks, but actually there's also been a big difference in the types of people that are using food banks. Interestingly, in the United States, street crime costs the economy around about $18 billion a year. Okay, now that is large, that's a lot of money, don't get me wrong. And we want to reduce that in terms of community safety, in terms of reducing victim numbers. We really want to work on reducing that. You're as likely to be a victim in your local community as you are a perpetrator when you live in poverty. So when we accentuate those problems, when those problems begin to bubble to the surface, then we see more and more of that, and that causes greater issues for us. But what is interesting and what we really haven't got to terms with yet is, if you look at the FBI's report from last year, just 2020, white collar crime actually costs the economy around about 800 million a year. That's a huge number, right? So we're starting to see an increase in the white collar crime as opposed to just street crime. Cyber crime, sorry, that should say, it is 800 million, because cyber crime costs the economy $4.2 billion. Just think about that. $4.2 billion in cybercrime. That's a huge jump, but it's not as big a jump as the predicted 2025 rise when you look at cybersecurity and groups like that, who are predicting that in this year it's going to cost us $6 trillion, and that's the work off from the pandemic. But figures are estimated to be $25 trillion worldwide by 2025. Okay. $25 trillion. That puts a lot of pressure on local economies, on national economies, but also on the global markets. We've seen yesterday there was the massive drop. I'm trying to think of who it was that collapsed yesterday. The Chinese building company that collapsed. Their shares have now plummeted through the night. So that's causing more of an add-on, more of a problem for us. It becomes police training then becomes a problem, because how do you deal with this change, this shift in crime, this change in responses to crime, where we can actually go and where we can investigate and what we can investigate and how we investigate it. As Rod said earlier, there's this tendency that the younger guys that are coming in, we hope, have a much better, more savvy approach to cyber industry and the electronic world. But actually, every one of us has one of these, right? Every one of us. So every one of us has the basics, has the, thank you, Rod. Yes, it was Evergrande. Their buyout for 51%, the company was going to buy them out 51%, has been rejected. So now Evergrande are just plummeting, and that's causing a mass knock-on effect worldwide. But as I said, so we all have one of these, okay? Now, if we all have a smartphone or its equivalent, we all have access to this electronic world, and we should all have at least some knowledge, some understanding of it, okay? That's very, very important. So in terms of police training, what I've been doing with my students over the last 5 years is we've started looking at law enforcement programs. We started looking at what the entry requirements are for officers that move in, for members of the public that move into police training and then become officers in the future, okay? What we know is that education in the United States has not changed its standards since the 1950s. So even though the level of education has increased, actually, for law enforcement, the requirement hasn't. So although there was a presidential debate and a presidential commission set up to look at education for law enforcement in the early 1960s, the recommendation from that being that you should have to have at least a bachelor's level of education for law enforcement officers, we're not seeing that carried through into the public, into training even today. In the 1950s, 59% had a high school education. Less than 10% had a college education. So actually having that 59% of people that had a high school diploma, it made sense to have law enforcement officers having exactly the same requirement, right? If your law enforcement officers have the same level of education, then you can bet they're going to be at the right standard. It's going to be where we need it to be. In 2019, the census found that over 90% now had a high school diploma. It's actually now at about 92.4%. It also notes that 62% went through some kind of college education. But the standard of education for law enforcement officers in the United States still stands as a minimum requirement at a high school diploma. Now that means that there's some disparity there between what our expectations are for the general public and what our expectations are for law enforcement. If they're not trained, if they're not educated to the same level, are they able to work and function at the same level as other people? Does that make sense? Yeah. So they're kind of the questions that we need to begin asking. Great proportion of training in the United States is around the use of firearms, okay, firearms training, and we see that around about 40% of all training is devoted to use of force and firearms. I know there's a couple of questions coming up, so I'm going to get to those in just a second if I can. Just need to scoot over to the slide.
I think, Andy, looking at them, there'll all be ones we can pick up after a break. Good questions, so ones to.
Brilliant. That'll be good for me if we can, yeah. But please do know, I'm not ignoring you. I have seen them there, and I'd love to be able to come up and talk about some of them. Okay, so yeah, so about 40% of all training is devoted to use of force and to firearms training. And don't get me wrong, there is a huge need for that training, being the fact that our officers are firearms carriers, okay? So every officer is able to carry a firearm. We really want them trained well, and we hope that their level of training carries them through that, okay? In 2013, however, there was the report onto mental health training with officers, which suggested an increase of training from 5 mandatory hours during their academy training to 16 hours. Just 16 hours. That's going to be important in just a second when I show you the next slide. But I just want you to think about that, okay? 10% of all arrests that are made in the United States, on average, have some form of mental health illness listed as part of the cause, okay? That's interesting in itself. But that's a diagnosed mental health issue, as opposed to the things that we see that are going on all the time. Depression, stress, stress related to employment, family conflict. Yeah, all of these are stressors on mental health, all right? And when you add all of that in, actually that number increases exponentially. So the idea that they have just 16 hours training really isn't a great deal and really needs to be addressed. Now, there are critical incident officers that are trained. They get up to 20 hours per year, but for the general standard and for most officers, that's not applicable. They are not critical incident officers. So add that all together. Minimum educational standard that's required is a high school diploma. 30% of officers currently have a 4-year bachelor's degree, so that's still less than the 65 to 67% that we're seeing in the general public, all right? But on average, law enforcement officers have 40 hours of training per year. So that's a huge resource, huge cost resource of putting them through that training every year to keep them up to date and to keep them moving forward, when you think that you then got the knock-on effect of having more officers carrying on overtime. To give you an example, here in Ohio, officers, when they go out on their 40 hours of training, they're given $20 recompense for every hour of training they do, okay? Now that sounds great, except the officer that has to cover that shift actually gets time and a half. So they get about $25 to $30 an hour, depending on what their time served is, what their rank is, that kind of thing. So you're paying actually $50 an hour. Does that make sense? All right. So the training is really important. It's really needed. But because there's so few staff that are trained to a sufficient level, wow, you're paying so much money just to have them there and have them trained. In the general population, an associate's degree accounts for 49% of all qualifications in the United States. Okay, so an associate's degree was a 2-year college. Remember way back a little bit earlier, I was talking about community colleges. Community colleges will give a 2-year diploma or degree. And you can take that and you can then take that onto a 4-year program and continue your college at a 4-year institution. Or you use that 2-year degree for the job that you want to take. 42% of the population currently have the bachelor's degree. So in all terms, the general population outstrips the law enforcement in terms of their education. Remember that 40 hours of training I was talking about? This is the Midwest region where I currently live, okay? So the states that you have here are Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia. These are the training hours required for an officer going through the academy, okay? This is what it looks like in terms of weeks. So if you happen to have 594 hours of training, that's 99 days, that's 16 and a half weeks. How much training does a law enforcement officer, a police officer have in the United Kingdom? If you're as low as 460, it's 12 and 3/4 weeks, okay? And the most training you get is in Pennsylvania, which is 23 and 3/4 weeks, okay? Now, that is the minimum. Please don't get me wrong. There are agencies that are doing much, much more than that, but this is the minimum requirement. Here in Ohio, where we have 737, I can name you 2 police departments, which are big municipal departments, Cleveland and Cincinnati, and they both require over 1,000 hours, okay? But as an average across the state, it's 737. That's the minimum, and that's where we're stuck. And that's dependent upon things like the amount of revenue they have, the size of the police department, the income they generate, the taxation that goes back into the police department to be able to afford that kind of level of training. As a direct comparison, in the state of Ohio, a barber requires 1,800 hours of training and a cosmetologist, so a beautician, requires 1,500 hours. Twice as many as a law enforcement officer, okay? So I just want you to think about what that means, okay? There are professions out there that require twice the training and have no responsibility or no decision to make over the future of somebody's life. Okay, that's kind of a weird position to be in. And it's not only me saying that, the reports that have been coming out over the last 10 years show us the same thing. Overwhelmingly, when we talk about crime, reports show us that there's a greater number of street crime than we've had before, and certainly during COVID. And as I said, domestic violence has increased exponentially. But the 2020 report showed cybercrime costing 4.2 billion and cybersecurity telling us it's going to be 6 trillion worldwide. Don't get cute, okay? Last few slides I want to go through, but don't get cute. You need to be trained in this stuff. Cybercrime is where it's all going. And that partly is because of where we find the world today, but certainly because of the way that we are now shopping, the way that we are now engaging with people. It means that our computers are out there and they're open all the time. I don't want anybody to answer these. These are just things that perhaps you want to think about, but do you know these terms? These are just general terms that are used when we talk about computing, when we talk about cybercrimes, but ransomware, double extortion, RAS, malware, Tor, DDoS, phishing, botnets, VPNs, okay? They're just examples. During the pandemic, ransomware attacks actually increased by 148% in the United States. It's huge, huge number, okay? And a lot of that is actually because most people will get emails from what looks like a legitimate site or even from their own company, and they open it. And the moment that you open it, it opens up that track. Ransomware now has developed greatly in the United States, or greatly worldwide. And now it's not about clicking a link, it's just about opening the email. Okay, so you need to be aware of those things. We have some interesting questions in the United States, and I really wanted to highlight this because it's really important for you guys if you come across a cybercrime or if you get involved in a cybercrime. But here in the United States, we've begun asking police officers to think about their use of language. Remember I said at the start, communication is very important. This is one of them. So in the United States, we talk about carbonated drinks as being either soda pop, or Coke, okay? This is what that looks like regionally, okay? So when you look at the areas that are soda, they're red. If you look at pop, it's blue. If you look at Coke, it's green. The reason why that's so very important is because when you're online and you're talking to somebody, if you're not using the correct term, if you're telling people that you're doing something or you're somewhere else, they can tell just by the way that you're talking. What you say is very, very important. So knowing the language is very important. One of the biggest areas that I investigate, one of the biggest areas that I have that I look at are gangs. And it's been something I've been looking at for 12 years now. So it's something that I've got really interested in. And I'm very interested in why gangs are moving this way, okay? On average, ransomware cost the individual in 2019, $11,605. So that's you and me in the street, right? We get ransomware and it demands a payment from us. It's now going to cost us $11,605. If you include additions and additional costs for companies, if you're using your company machine, if you're looking at something on the internet, okay, the average cost rose to $200,000 during the pandemic because they closed down the company's access. The FBI said that ransomware generated $3 billion for criminal organizations in 2020. And according to Lloyd's in London, businesses stand to lose 400 billion globally to ransomware in the next year. So, you know, when you click on that thing and your boss says, thanks, you just wrecked our email. This is the number they're talking about. Okay, it really is important. You should also note that the fear of this type of crime has birthed a cybercrime industry that's currently worth around $200 billion a year. All right. So the more that you make mistakes, the more that you don't understand who you're talking to or what's going on, the more the cyber industry actually makes a lot of money. So it has knock-on effects, both good and bad. But we have to remember that this is the problem. Now, for gangs, it's hugely attractive because actually the type of sentencing you get is lower than if you're involved in street crimes, because we have other things that we can add to it. So not only did you do a street robbery, but you're also involved in a gang, you're also carrying a gun, blah, 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 and all of that gets added up, okay? For gangs, if they're involved in online crime, nobody dies. That's huge, right? That's huge. So for the gangs, they're safer, they're making much more money, and actually the increases are exponential. One of the guys you want to talk to is Dr. Nick Pammett, University of Portsmouth, who's looking at crime in a slightly different way. He's actually looking at wildlife crime and the benefits of wildlife crime. The huge amount of money that people are making from the illegal eel trade, for example. Okay, so crime is changing massively. So in summary, our focus has always been on street crime, and there's nothing wrong with that. We need to control that, okay? But they're easy crimes. They're crimes that are seen. We can easily identify the victim. Criminals simply don't care that you're looking at street crime. It's much easier and much better for a criminal organization to hire a hacker. If they can get somebody that's good on the internet, they know they're steps ahead of local policing agencies. So why would you walk into the bank? Okay, they can make millions of dollars much, much faster through using ransomware and wireware, malware, those kind of things, right? The FBI here in the United States says that if you walk into a bank, the money that you'll walk away with on average is around $7,500. It's just not lucrative, okay? And as I said earlier, sentences are not comparable when it's so well kept, okay? So education is a great tool. It's, for me, education and training is one of those big things that we really, really need to address and get grips on in the future. But it's also about adaptation. It's about planning. It's about management. It's about ethical practice. It's about learning personnel. It's about professional engagement. It's about cultural respect and so much more. We know that law enforcement officers that are trained to at least an associate degree level are 30% less likely to become involved in an altercation with a member of the public rather than those that only have a high school diploma. Okay, we already know that. So why aren't we requiring a higher level of education? Bear in mind, it's not only the qualification that makes the difference, but also the ability of the officer to communicate. And that comes back to this idea that actually through engaging with other people in other areas, you actually become far better at communicating. And that communication level very often comes from your engagement in education and training, because you're exposed to more people from other areas and for other backgrounds, okay? The best way to tackle the problems is definitely through communication. We need to learn that communication. We need to be far better at it. Your ability to connect and communicate with members of the public, give a greater sense of engagement with that local community, and has shown to have greater success with the local community because they know that you're there and they feel that you're engaged with them rather than some other agency. In periods of lockdown, I know that's very, very difficult, and it has been over the last 18 months because we've been taken away from that engagement. But that's really where we need to get back into those local communities. Local communities want to know that you're there and you're there for them, and you're supporting them. And we need to get better at communicating with those communities if we want those communities to support the work that we're doing. Sorry, Rob, we're back to you.
Thanks, Dean. Just go back one. Right, so thank you. Actually, just need to take control, and I can't remember how to do that. Just go on one slide for me for the moment, Andy.
Yeah.
And then just so thank you very much, Andy. We've seem to have covered a huge amount of different issues there in the last hour and a bit, and we've got a few points to come out of the chat. What I'd like to do is for us to take a quick break so everyone get a drink and stand up, because if you're anything like me, your legs will probably start feeling like they're not connected to you anymore. If we get back together at 5:20 UK time, so in 6 minutes time, just give everyone a chance to get themselves a drink, come back. And at that stage, you want to just pick up on these sort of 4 questions and the bits of feedback that we've got from the questions so far. So I'd like to look at what can we do now to deal with the violence against women and girls? What are the risks we can see coming and what can we do about them? How do we build trust and confidence in this difficult time? And what do the police across the world need to do to prepare for the next 12 months? So those are the 4 questions that I'd like comments on. Go away, get yourselves a drink, stretch your feet, and I'll see you in a few minutes' time. Thank you very much. Thanks, Andy. That was good.
Hopefully that hit everything.
Okay, everybody, we can get back. We've got about just under 40 minutes. Sorry, come back on and start coughing. That's not a good start. I think if we just spend a few minutes going through the questions that we've had so far, and then try and get you to, as an audience, to engage with us a bit more. So we had a question from Tinanen Mayot. And please tell me if I got your pronunciation horrendously wrong. I hope that's close to being right. About how do you approach dividing your resources to deal with the increase in white-collar crime? So, Andy, because there's a slightly different structure in policing in the US, how are these big white-collar crimes investigated? Who deals with them, or do they slip between the cracks of various law enforcement agencies?
So part of the problem that we have in the US is the way that the system is structured. So you have local forces, local police departments, but you'll also then have a sheriff's department. You also have a state police, and then you'll have the FBI above that. To complicate matters further, we also have bureaus of investigation. So every state has its own version of the FBI, if you like. So that complicates it just that little bit more, in that we're then dealing with 5 or 6 different layers at once. So a lot of it can get lost. The problem with things like white-collar crime is it is, to a greater or lesser extent, very, very specialized. So you need people that are trained in that area. And local forces simply don't have the money for that kind of personnel. Occasionally, they are able to get additional funding, and they can outsource it to local forensic accountants, people like that can actually look through a particular case. But it's not the kind of case that a local agency would want to take on. They would then punt that up the chain, and that's where things can get lost along the way. The State Bureau of Investigation, so here in Ohio, it's the Ohio Bureau of Investigation, cannot take a case on unless a local agency makes a case for them to take it on. So you first have to approach the Bureau of Investigation and ask them to take it on if they have the resources available. It also depends whether it's considered to be a local crime or whether it's considered to be state or whether it's national, because that will dictate who actually controls and runs that case. So the FBI will get involved once it crosses state borders, those kind of things, which gets particularly messy if it's a crime that's perpetrated online, but all of the crime takes place in one state, because actually it's federal, but it's local at the same time. So it's a very, very messy system, and it's something that really needs to be addressed, and it's very, very hard to grapple with. How do we get on with it best? I think the way that it is done in the United States with this tiered system helps local agencies to access the services that they just can't afford to have. Where I live, it's a farming area. We actually don't have a police department at all. Our local police department is far enough away that we have to rely on the state police. But the state police only have 2 police officers, 2 law enforcement officers that cover this jurisdiction at any one time, and the area is pretty vast. So that's the kind of situation you find yourselves in, and that's why you find a lot of cyber criminals are moving into more remote areas where it's harder to find them. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's certainly how we find ourselves right now, and it's something that we're working desperately to change. And that comes with training.
So I think the picture in the UK made the face of it look simpler because of slightly smaller number of layers, but we have exactly the same issue about the resourcing. And I think this comes back to my thoughts about focus. At the moment, our focus is not specifically enough on white-collar crime, and we therefore deal with a lot of it by reference to fraud can't remember what the name of the agency is, but that's really a victim support agency rather than a dealing with the issue agency.
Yeah.
We have this constant debate about whether it's a cross-border issue, and we've got somebody. That's it. Thank you. So this cross-border issue and which force is going to deal with it, and with most white-collar crime, it's clearly a number of forces that will be affected, and the National Crime Agency just probably doesn't have the resources. I think this takes on nicely to Karen's question, which is about getting people from outside the police. And Andy sort of mentioned the use of forensic accountants as private individuals working, and I know the National Crime Agency spend quite a considerable amount of time working with other people to do some of this investigation for them. But the
only, sorry about in Rob.
No, go on.
The only problem for me has always been this idea that you're working in a local community, right? You're the local officer. You're the officer that responds to somebody's granny that's been ripped off for her life savings. Okay, she was on the internet. She was looking up her granddaughter dancing, as an example, only because my niece has been dancing in the last month. And somebody scooped her email, spoofed her whole system, took the bank details and got all of her money. That granny doesn't care that you're going to employ somebody from outside. She wants to know what you're doing right now. You're that point of contact. And you're right, maybe we can make greater use of people from outside agencies, but you need to be able to, as the responding officer, you need to be able to sit down with that victim and say, this is what's happened. This is how it came about. This is how to rectify it now to prevent it happening in the future. And this is what we are doing as a service to follow up on this crime. And we will contact you at each step of the way. It has to be done that way because people in the general public just don't understand these crimes or how they get how these crimes get through. What happens? Why have they become a victim? Yeah, and that's really important for the general public.
I think I think those are really important points. Well, one of the concerns I have is that the number of people who are becoming victims of this type of crime is considerably high, and the longer we are behind the curve, if you like, in terms of the response to it, the bigger the impact on people's trust and confidence in the police generally to deal with issues. So it's a sort of two-handled problem. One is that policing historically and even still today is focused on policing hotspot areas where street crime happens, whether that's in the US or in the UK, which tends to be poorer communities, tends to be very diverse communities, and tends to be people who are committing crime where the majority of the crime is committed on other local people or people travelling through there. And what
I did want to say though, just if people haven't seen it in the chat, Dean Andrews has highlighted Future Learn. They have a free cybercrime course, a cyber security and cybercrime course on there. Their Future Learn is really, really good. They've also got Psychology 101. They've got Understanding Culture. They've got a whole bunch of courses, and they're very, very short courses. And it will really help people to get their heads around just the very simplistic parts of it. You know, don't wait for somebody else to have all the knowledge that you want them to have. Pick up those little bits yourselves. They're really good to use.
That's good. And Tinan, again, I apologise if I pronunciation on that. The question around the change in the standard level of education. The UK has just made a shift into a requirement for officers to either have a degree on joining or to join on a degree level apprenticeship, so they achieve a degree in their initial training as part of their programme, or they complete a degree programme in their initial training. And the concept behind that, the intention of it, is to accelerate staff development. It's not necessarily a feeling from a UK perspective.
Does that? Sorry, does that not mean that your result, because obviously we're discussing the lack of resources and sort of spreading them out evenly and trying to deal with crimes that way and having the resources for those crimes. But if you're then preventing people from joining because obviously they don't have the grades or whatever that's required to join the police force, then you're not going to have enough resources as it is. So what's the process behind that? Like the process of thought?
Yeah, so to be honest, at the moment, the police service is actually managing to get significantly more people applying to join as a result of this shift. So the actual impact on joining has been lower. And what's also been interesting is that the impact on the diversity of people joining has changed. So as the police have moved into this, more women are joining and more people from ethnic backgrounds are joining. And there are probably two things around that are happening. One is people are coming in with just about making the requirement for the graduate course, for the degree course. So people are getting onto things a little bit easier than they would if they were joining a university degree separately, because of the amount of wraparound that's put around them. But secondly, we've got people who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford to go away and study for a degree initially. So they're now getting this studying within their work time and all their costs paid for. And the other thing is there are quite a large number of more graduates applying since there. And the thought process that is actually this is being looked at the moment to understand why. But the working proposition is that because we've raised the expectation around policing that it is a graduate profession, that people are more likely to come into policing having spent the time studying. So at the moment, the outcome is actually good in terms of recruitment and the move forward. Time will tell whether this approach actually accelerates people's learning. The intention is that to get to, it's not about completing the first 2 years worth of training. The intention is that at the end of 2 or 3 years, the new officers will have reached a level that on the old training program people would have taken 5 or 6 years to reach. So it's trying to accelerate that, but building the skills for lifelong learning, if you like, building the skills for people to actually access more opportunities later on in their career. I think it's early days, and for the Met is only is in its first year of doing this, so I don't think we've got any idea what the impact on the Met is. Nationally, there are a few forces where people have done 3 years on the programme and are now out working as confirmed police officers. So there are a few places where there is evidence of what's come out. Does that sort of make sense, Jan?
Yeah, sure. Sorry about that. I had to unmute myself.
No problem at all. Yeah, I put in the chat the length of training for UK officers. So at the moment for apprentices on the degree programme, it's about 30 weeks. That's the amount of time they're abstracted from their workplace. That doesn't include 8 weeks where they're directly being tutored, and the rest of the 2 years when they're working alongside people working in highly supervised areas. So it's probably a bit more than that, but it's 30 weeks. The thing that surprises me most about it is that for direct entry detectives, it's 36 weeks. So we're expecting those people who are now coming in with the sole purpose of being a detective to be fully qualified as a police officer, pass all the national investigation exams, and be assessed as competent as detectives in a 2-year period, and they only get 36 weeks, so an extra 6 weeks of learning. So it's quite a big ask, some of these things, I think, and time will tell whether it works.
It's interesting that you say that. I mean, if you add those 8 weeks, so the greatest amount is going to be 44 weeks. That's still twice the amount of training that an officer gets in the United States.
And they don't have to carry any guns for that.
And they don't carry guns, right?
So Dan,
That's probably why you get a lot of misconduct in the United States, a lot more than you do in the UK.
So, yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because it's something I don't want to bring up unless people want to talk to me about it. But yes, I mean, the levels of misconduct in officers that we see are horrendous. And you really, when you start to look at the level of training they've had, you've got to question what happened. Where have these people come from, and why have they been given the opportunity to carry a badge and gun in the first place? You know, you think about people like the Tamir Rice shooting, if you think about George Floyd, if you look at the officers' education standard and you look at the background they've had in the past, then you've got to begin to question things. The very weird thing here in the United States, just to let you know if nobody's aware, if you leave your position before you are fired, so if you're charged with misconduct and you leave your position before you're fired, you are not prevented from taking up another position as a law enforcement officer with another agency. Wrap your head around that one.
So it wasn't that different from that in the UK up until a few years back when the new list of barred list was created. So now you leave before your discipline is finished, you'll go onto a barred list unless you can apply to be taken off the barred list. And if you're convicted, not convicted is the wrong word, but if you're found misconduct, you go onto the barred list as well. So that's
that puts American citizens at risk of being in danger from people that are supposed to protect them.
Massive risk, and that's why we have a crisis in confidence, because people in the public don't trust the officers because they don't know who they are, where they've come from, they don't know what training they've had. Most of the officers don't understand the local communities. The biggest problem that we've got here in the US for local police departments, they're in cars. You don't see an officer walk down a street. That's huge, because there's no connection to that local community. There's an officer that I work with quite regularly, Sean. I won't say which department he's with or where he is. He's an awesome, awesome guy. And I've been out on patrol with him many, many times. And one of the things that he does is when we go into the local areas, he was a basketball player in college. That's how he got his degree. But he stops the car, parks it, radios in that he's on the street, and then he gets out and he shoots hoops with the local kids. That's an officer that wants to know the local community, and it's a local community that want to talk to the officer. That's different. That's what we need to see from every officer.
So to be honest, in my policing time, and although I played basketball, you wouldn't want to see me shooting hoops. Yeah, it's just too embarrassing. Dan raised an issue around police training. So on firearms, and I know from previously, so this is going back 10 years when we reviewed firearms training in the Met, was probably one of the best bits of training. Firearms and public order training were the two areas that stood out as way above everything else in terms of how they did business. And there were two things that were particularly impressive on the reviews. One of them was the fact that the officers had this, just believed that they had to practice doing what they're doing to be able to do their job. So they had completely bought into the concept of training. Well, not completely, but very highly bought into it. The other one was the fact that the best officers had to do this rotation where they were teaching the new officers. So your most skilled and experienced officers were constantly going through a rotation of being involved with the training of others. And that for something of this nature, so it seemed to bring a completely different dynamic to the learning environment from anything elsewhere. And I think probably from a UK perspective underlines how important it is for an organisation to see the education of its staff as important. And when it does, then you can achieve quite great things with that. So I really would want to now sort of move a little bit to some specific questions and try and get those of you who are here on a Thursday afternoon heading towards 6 o'clock to engage as well. About some other risks. We talked about risks from a couple of dynamics, but what do you, having heard what we said this afternoon and from your own experience, think the risks of policing are, and what we might need to do about them? I'm asking a general question to save me picking on somebody, but you know, a few of my students in there know they'll get picked on in a minute. So. So, Tim Chow, that's a really interesting question. So the whole issue around fake news. So, Andy, how do you think police legitimacy is affected by social media and the fake news type agenda?
So there's two things here: social media and fake news. Okay, and we can take them together or take them separately. But one of the things I want to pick up on with social media, one of the great things that's going on here in the United States at the moment, is the use of social media by police departments. And it's one of the greatest advances that they've got for a number of reasons. But I'll give you a good example. If you look at Houston, Texas, look at the Houston Police Department in Texas, okay, they're spending a great deal of time and effort working with their social media team to get information out to the public as quickly as they can. So as soon as an offence takes place, as soon as there's a report of something happening, the first thing you get is officer on the scene at this location, such and such an altercation's taken place. But then within 5 minutes, you'll get an update of officer has responded to the scene, officer now has details of crime in progress, please remain calm and away from the scene. So there's constant updates all the time. And Houston Police Department are great at it. I would say they are probably one of the best departments I've ever seen using social media. And it's right down to officers on the street. They all have access. They all have the opportunity to go in and use things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, those kind of things. And you see pictures of officers popping up with the local kids or in the local community centers. You see flashes come up from officers talking about what they're doing, where they're located and why they're there today. So you get all this information all the time. The local sheriff's office here, to show you where we've gone with social media, actually puts up on their page, on Friday night between 9 and 1 a.m., we're going to be on these 3 junctions. And we're going to be examining people, stopping people to search them and to test whether or not they're over the legal limit. Now, you can take that as you like, but what they're actually doing is they're reducing the opportunities for people to drive their cars in high residency areas when they've been over the legal limit. It's great, right? If you're not using your social media and looking at where
Not
they are.
really.
No?
I mean, it depends on how you look at it. Once, as you said, it depends on how you look at it. Sorry, I'm outside. It depends on how you look at it. If you're telling them exactly where you're going to be, yep, checking cars and making sure that people are within the legal limit, then they're just not going to drive down that way. Do you see
But
what I
that's
mean?
what we want. We don't want them in local residency areas. Don't forget, you've still got the other officers that are out on traffic patrol. But in that local community area, we don't want children, we don't want families put at risk, we don't want pedestrians put at risk. So that's why they highlight those areas. If you come here, you're going to get caught. Stay away. But then you've got all the other officers that are out on patrol in all the other districts anyway. So it's kind of a top and tail system.
So you're just basically taking pressure from one side and putting it onto another.
I think
yes.
I think I'd come in on that. I think there's a considerable amount of evidence that the majority of people who commit crime, and that includes drink driving, do it in an area that they're very comfortable with, normally close to where they either work, live, or they have a recreational connection. And all of the evidence has shown that disrupting people from those normal patterns doesn't actually create crime somewhere else. That actually the fact you've disrupted them is far more likely to prevent them committing an issue than it is in terms of getting them to commit it somewhere else. This is particularly the case around things like burglary and street crime, where if people will only commit it in the areas where they feel comfortable. So there is an evidence base to suggest that by stopping them doing it in one location, you're reducing the risk of them doing it overall. So I do think there is some basis in the argument. I also, you're quite right. Of course, if you're going to drive home from something and the cop's going to be on this corner, the likelihood is you're going to go around a different corner. But they would have done that if you hadn't been there anyway. So there's probably a bit of a two-handled sword with that. So let's come back to that in a minute, because I've got other questions. Can we just deal with the fake news bit from your perspective, Andy?
The fake news here in the US that I've observed, or that I've talked to officers about, is really pushed by the fact that the officers can't actually say anything, or they can't do anything at the time when that instance appears on social media. And they're kind of governed by the fact that they're investigating something. So you can't really say anything. And it wouldn't be appropriate to do so. And that's what causes a lot of the problems. The problem for us is news is now instant. And you see the amount of instances that appear on social media that give you a snapshot of something taking place. I'm thinking, for instance, there was a young black male that was held down by an officer and had a gun pointed at him. And all you see is the young guy laying on the floor with the officer pointing the gun at him. But actually what you don't see is 2 minutes prior to that, he had a blade pointed at a young woman. That's the problem. So you're not always getting all the facts all the time. And that creates a huge problem for the police not being able to respond, because then the local community doesn't have the information. Why was that guy held at gunpoint? Why did the officer arrest them? What was the altercation? They have none of that context. And by the time they're able to report that, hours, days, weeks later, the community's already made its mind up about it. So our response has to be quicker and has to deal with things much more effectively. And that's something that we're not getting to grips with at the moment.
I think the two parallels I'd add to that, one of them is that really the police role in this has got to be very authoritative. So one of the problems with I've seen with the use of social media and with people responding is they quite often respond before they know all the facts, and therefore they actually respond with something which isn't right. So actually making sure that the response is correct is so important overall, otherwise the fake news gets to really take off. The other one is just a sort of story from our policing past. You have to have a story from your policing past. After in London in 2005, there was a series of bombings, and I got asked to go urgently to MI5, to military intelligence, for a briefing on something that was coming out of the investigation, something that the intelligence service wanted us to know. So drove at high speed across London into MI5 headquarters, have to get all your stuff in, went in for this briefing, and I'm standing in this room being briefed in order to go back and tell the commissioner about something which was really important, that it was kept a secret. And behind the guy who was briefing me, Sky News were saying exactly the same story. So it was the whole issue of, the news industry can get ahead of the way that we all work, and social media is just massively ahead of us. And the risk around fake news is phenomenal, but also the risk of seeing things through a particular lens. So as Andy was saying, only seeing part of the story, not seeing the whole story is really important, and the police not actually being ready to deal with it. Karen, you raised a really interesting issue here about the working with social media and domestic abuse. Could you just sort of give me a bit of an idea of what you were talking about?
Yes, I can. 2008, I dealt with a domestic murder. The lady had put on Facebook, social media, that she was now single and who she was seeing, etc., etc. That triggered enough for him to go around and basically he slaughtered her in front of her children. I know we can't control what these people do, but the more you talk about yourself and what you're doing, where you are, and the personal situation you're in, the more you're vulnerable you become. So I'm not in favour of it.
I think one of the things I don't think that we've really come to grasp with is the shift in public and private space that the new communication systems and social media bring. So people, generally people think that they're in a private space when they're sending social media, forgetting they're in public. And also from a police investigative point of view, quite often we're looking at things thinking they're in public when actually they're in private. And getting that balance right puts risks in investigation. So I think it's quite horrendously complex. And the one issue I think that forces are still struggling with is this whole, what looks like an investigation of the victim of rape when we start looking through their social media to try and ensure that we've dealt with the potential defence from a suspect. And how we get that right. So I think there are so many issues with social media and with what people put out there and people's understanding of what it means and where it is, that you've highlighted quite an important point there, Karen.
And also, Karen, if I can, please don't get me wrong. I'm not a fan of social media. I don't like social media, but it is a great tool for officers when they're doing their work. But also, we've just had a big thing here in the US at the end of August, as schools are going back, where local departments are putting up information onto things like Facebook to say, when you send your kids to school, don't take a picture saying John Smith, class 1A, teacher's name, first day at school, this date, this building, which is very, very common because people do it for their families, forgetting that actually that's open to so many other people in the world that now you've exposed your child to all of those problems as well. So there is a lot to get through, and a lot of it is about teaching the general public what they're doing as much as it is anybody else. It's about making sure the general public know what's going on and what they need to be aware of. But those campaigns happen every year, and it's to make sure that those children are kept safe.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Just one more thing. How do we reach women, especially with domestic abuse with families? What media could we go through, keeping it safe and letting them know that they shouldn't be doing that? What path should they go down, in your opinion?
In my opinion, that's a really, really hard question. There are services that we could use to make contact and stay in contact with people. Things like making greater use of WhatsApp. Yeah, so we can actually contact somebody and say, are you aware that this is in an open space, not a private space? Are you aware that these services are now available in your local community, in your local area? And forming those kind of WhatsApp groups to support that as well. WhatsApp is just one example. There are many out there. And my kids tell me every day that there's a new one they're using that I know nothing about. I think we need to develop better systems to be able to help people to be aware of what they're seeing. I hate the idea of us actually telling people they can't do something, but maybe just providing the education and providing the information more than anything to help them to see that actually everybody's able to see what they're doing. I think that's really important. There are groups around where we live, Notts Township around this area, they have their own group, which is for single parents. I think that's a great step. And they've taken that on board themselves, and they do that with a local councillor. And they have access to local officers whenever they need them. So those kind of things are really helpful. But I've got to be honest and say, to answer your question fully, I'd need to spend a lot of time looking at it and thinking about it. And it's something I'd like to look at. You know, what else can we do? How can we do it? So thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much.
That's great. And Tim Chow, thank you for your comment about Mary Aitken. So lots of I think it's quite interesting from a policing perspective to see the number of people who with no law enforcement background who are now becoming really important in the response to these sorts of crimes and helping us with a better understanding of it. I think what I want to do at this stage is just say is that's a fairly intensive couple of hours people have had in front of the screen. Thank you very much for being very engaged, and the questions, they've been really helpful. I think I would sort of put in here into some of the issues when I'm thinking about the feedback from people. A bit of a focus on training and education, because that's come through as being important and needing to look at. A raising of the issue around social media and new digital communications. And really, I suppose that generic bit that Andy was talking about, which is this focus on street crime when there is so much more going on in the world, and how we try and get that balance right. So those are probably the key points that I will want to take from there. But if anybody wants to contact me outside of the meeting or outside of the meetings, very happy to hear from you. There should be a contact number, email address sent to you as part of our follow-up, but please do send if there's anything else. And I'll just say thank you to Andy and hand over to Bob.
Thank you very much, guys.
Rod and Andy, thank you both so much for your time this afternoon. Two packed hours of interesting topics around policing, contrast between the UK and the States, and I have no doubt that those topics will be revisited at our conference on the 23rd of November. Thanks to everybody who's joined us today. It's always great to have you, and thanks again for the interaction. Next week, if you can join us, there are 3 workshops, Monday, Wednesday and Thursday, with our friends from the International Police Association. So a whole range of different European countries giving their perspectives on the impact of COVID and other issues. So again, please join us for that. All the details are on the brochures on the London Policing College website. So from the London Policing College, Rod, Andy and everybody that's joined us, thank you ever so much, and hopefully we'll see you all next week. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
And don't knock your basketball, Rod. It wasn't that bad. He was quite good, Andy, to be honest.
I get shamed every day. Every day.
Well, you know the answer to that. We were the same down in Peckham with the youth. Because we were old even then, Rod. That was the sad thing.
That was the problem, I think, always.
Anyway, yeah, that went well, guys. Thanks ever so much. And great to see you, Andy, after our phone call.
Yeah, you too. I've got a question. Can you, Karen Hunt, who was asking about domestic violence and social media at the end there, can you give her my email address? But I want to give her my consultancy address.
She's just coming back on the call. She must have heard you talking about her.
Give me 2 seconds.
Oh, she's gone again.
Karen, where are you?
Yeah.
I am here. I just had to go and.
I think if you put it in the chat, she should get it anyway. Because she's one of our associates, so she'll pick it up from there.
Okay.
So even after the meeting, she should get it sent to her.
Or if you want to email it to me, Andy, I'll ping it onto her.
Yeah.
I'll do that. That way I can make sure she gets it. Just because she picked up a really, really interesting point, and I really do want to take a look at it and see what else is going on at the moment and what we need to do going forward.
Yeah. She's an interesting character, Karen. She's really good.
A lot of energy.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Right.
Thank
you, guys.
I will call it a day. I presume Palmjit has to turn off the recording, so I'll leave her to.
Yeah, Palmjit's in charge.
Deal with that. Brilliant.
Thanks Andy.
Great.
Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon or evening for you guys, and I'll speak to you real soon.
Off out now. Cheers, guys.
Cheers, guys. Bye.
Thanks, Palmjit.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Mommy, did you just leave the meeting?